Hello, welcome to Varnblog. And today, Benjamin Studebaker has returned. And we are talking about a couple of things. We're going to start out with his article recently in Isonomia Quarterly. But just a reminder of his prior works. He wrote The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut in 2023. And then Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies in 2024, which is now, I think, finally out in an affordable paperback version. And this is tangentially related to those topics, but only tangentially. I wanted to get you on to talk about geopolitics, trade wars, social tension, and then maybe launch off from that to talk about contemporary domestic politics. So in your piece for Isonomia Quarterly, you explore how economic friction is being recontextualized and partially weaponized in modern geopolitics, and that the trade disputes between the United States and global allies are not really just economic disagreements, or to put it in another way, all economic disagreements are downstream of geopolitics because geopolitics is downstream of microeconomics, or macroeconomics, not micro, that big economics. Do you agree with that contention, by the way, that this is, that a lot of these geopolitical tensions are economic, but the way that they're being sold to the general public is completely misleading, and the framing is just frankly wrong?
Yeah, there's discontent with the way the global trade system works. There's at the level of the World Trade Organization in particular, which the United States has gradually disabled by blocking appointments to the WTO appellate body. It has made the WTO unable to hear trade disputes and therefore unable to enforce its own rules. And that's a policy which sort of started with Obama and refusing to reappoint a couple of specific people on the grounds that he felt that they had ruled unfavorably against US interests. And then Donald Trump in the first term refused to appoint anybody to the WTO appellate body. And then Biden continued that policy. And so now when there's a trade dispute, there has to be some other way of trying to adjudicate it. And the United States has tended to prefer bilateral discussions, whereas the European Union and many of the allied states have tried to construct a replacement arbitrating body, the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement. Mm-hmm. But many states have refused to join that body, and so that body is not really able to function in the way that the WTO appellate body was.
So one of the things that you pointed out, that this means that U.S. allies have actually been in a kind of bizarre holding pattern where they don't have a lot of actual sovereignty for geopolitical movement. They might have some sovereignty for domestic movement and their domestic production, but they can't really do a lot geopolitically. And because energy politics is downstream of geopolitics, it also constrains their domestic politics in a very real way. And you've really pointed out this is intensified under the second Trump administration, where the U.S. is aggressively demanding allies make contributions to the global public goods by purchasing American weapons and liquefied natural gas. There's been a lot of pushback on that, but that has meant that actually NATO member states in Europe, that are not the U.S., have agreed to drastically scale up their military spending, which was originally the goal in the first place. If you go back to the first Trump administration, that was stated explicitly. So you seem to think that this is actually playing into U.S. hands, that this is actually part of what the U.S. wants.
Yeah, part of the strategy with the Europeans is to have them legitimate what the United States wants by framing it as anti-American policy. what the United States wants is framed as something which will increase European autonomy. So back in the first Trump administration, a lot of EU member states were only spending about 1% of GDP on defense, even though the NATO requirement was 2%. And over the course of the first Trump and then Biden administrations, European states were compelled to meet the 2% target with continuous pressure from the United States on the issue of Ukraine. If the Europeans want the United States to stay engaged with Ukraine, then the Europeans have got to make their contribution and meet the NATO defense spending target. As these states were all getting up to around 2%, and Germany still hadn't quite made it there. It was at, I think, 1.9% in 2024. The United States said, okay, now we need to raise the NATO defense spending requirement to 3.5% en route to an eventual target of 5% of GDP. So just as soon as the Europeans meet the old 2% target, the goalposts move on them. And Spain is the only state in NATO that has not signed on to these new targets. All the rest have done so. And they're now framing this defense spending as a way of increasing policy autonomy from the United States. But none of them are quitting NATO. So they're all doing it within the framework of the NATO command structure. And they're legitimating it on the grounds that the United States poses a threat to them. So there's this deep irony in the policy, because it's exactly what successive US presidents of both parties have been wanting them to do. And indeed, it goes above and beyond what the Americans have been asking for years.
I think this is actually interesting, because one of the things that it becomes immediately obvious to me is that while this is often framed as a deviation under Trump from traditional American policy, this has been a consistent American demand intention, at least since the end of the nominal end of the global war on terror. So since the second Obama administration. And I find this fascinating. I guess one thing to ask, I mean, you're not European, I'm not either, but do you think the Europeans know that they are doing this? Is this like a domestic selling point where they know they're complying to US issues, but have figured out a way to frame it as anti-United States, or is it really an ideological blind spot?
The European leadership knows. The European leadership has, many prime ministers and so on have explicitly said that they're making these commitments and that they have to find a way to get the public on board with these commitments, even though the public doesn't understand the depth of entanglement with the United States. The British in particular, I can't remember who it was, but somebody in the last couple of weeks who's quite important said that the public doesn't understand the degree to which the entire British system is embedded within the American system at this point in ways that cannot be undone, such that no matter what Trump does, it can't really be in the UK strategic interest to disentangle at the level of the military and the security apparatus. And that, I think, has been the agenda for the Europeans for quite a while, has been to keep the United States engaged in Europe, in part for the purposes of deterring the Russians, in part for the purposes of preventing the Europeans from potentially having to cover their own defense spending and manage their own internal security affairs. It's difficult in European politics to legitimate, say, the creation of a European army. That's something that many European leaders have been interested in, but they haven't been able to do politically. And if they're ever going to be able to do that, it will be by pretending that a European army is a counterpower to the United States.
But, in your article, you basically say this is an illusion of a possible Euro-Gaullism, a return to, this Macron era. Macron trying to bring up the specter of the Gaul, and it's both farcical, but also it's not just farcical in the sense that they don't intend to do it. It's that it has at least three substantive benefits to the United States. One of which is, despite calls for more military integration with, and arms trade with China, that that's been relatively limited, and NATO's not really seriously pursuing it. But other things have been that it would improve the balance of trade between Europe and the United States, at least on paper, which would give the GOP, if not a real, at least a nominal economic win. That it would subsidize the growth of the U.S. military industrial base without requiring more domestic tax hikes, which is what the tariffs have been a backdoor way to do here. And that it would actually relieve pressure on the U.S. federal budget the way the Marshall Plan did, facilitating those tax cuts that Trump likes so much, and leaving Europe at a massive tax disadvantage for economic growth. So why do you think this is persuasive to so many people? Because to me, it's like transparently a bad deal.
Yeah, I think the Europeans feel that they're not going to be able to move forward with the Americanizing neoliberal reforms that they were looking to do after 2008 without creating a different kind of fiscal situation. And so if you make your budget more like an American budget, then that will entail certain logics with regard to reform of the public services, cutting of welfare benefits. So increasing defense spending puts fiscal pressure on all other programs that makes it easier to make European society and European budgets look more American. But for precisely that reason, historically, the European left has opposed increases in military spending. And in the piece, I give a few different examples of prominent European leaders who've been quoted saying, if you increase military spending, it's going to lead to an erosion of the social state. And then this is going to lead to the spread of right-wing movements in Europe. It's been said continuously across many different national contexts for more than 50 years, right? But if you can convince people to raise defense spending on the grounds that this is necessary to keep out the Russians, and that it's necessary to give you insurance against a volatile and untrustworthy United States, then all of this can be achieved, and it can facilitate the Americanizing of the European continent, actually, in the name of resisting precisely that process.
I think, the first quote you give is Bevon all the way back in 1951, right? Like this is an old siren song, and it also seems like this will be able to push through austerity, particularly when combined with seeming energy crises. And I've noticed this tendency that the Europeans have had recently to say want to deal with climate change by making it a military and national security issue, which is also entirely misleading, and what it would do and how it would go and how it would change the public framework. So it does seem, however, that global anti-Trumpism is it's not just the Democrats that use this as a legitimating ideology. That this seems to be a center ideology all the way to Keir, Starmer, and Macron. And I don't. I wonder how much of the European left, particularly in the center and north of Europe, will fall for this. And I mean, it does seem like it seems completely discrediting domestically to central left politics. I mean, we could talk about Keir Starmer, who seems to be in free fall, but also as now having the Labour government do things that the Tories could never pull off, including stuff like more or less ending the Magna Carta. So how do you think this is going to go?
Yeah, there was a critique of Starmer that came from Blair recently. This big 5,000 word Blair essay about problems with Starmer. And, the objection from Blair is that the UK has to prioritize growth, which means prioritizing AI and the tech sector. And the net zero commitment gets in the way of growth, so therefore has to be dumped. And the one thing that the UK has to be committed to is an increase in defense spending to deal with new geopolitical threats around the world. And therefore, the UK has to first dump the net zero commitment, make a plan to cut welfare spending over the course of the next few years, with a view to eventually dropping the tax rate. And that essay, that Blair put out was feted by a lot of people on the internet and in British politics, all over the place. And it caused, Andy Burnham, who is considering a leadership challenge against Starmer, to start hemming and hawing about what had been reported to be his initial plan to make Ed Miliband, who is very committed to net zero, Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's now suggesting he might keep Rachel Reeves in post. So there's a little bit of fright with regard to the net zero commitment here. And I think this has a lot to do with the war in Ukraine and the war in Iran. Both of these things raised energy costs considerably, increased the reliance of the European Union and the UK on North America for liquefied natural gas. Totally changed the energy supply chains in that regard. And all of that, of course, comes back to Obama and his commitment to promoting shale oil drilling. Under Obama, shale oil drilling took off massively, even as he acted like he was interested in keeping it in the ground or not building pipelines. All that meant in practice was that you'd stick the shale oil on bomb trains instead of delivering it through pipelines. It wasn't any kind of substantive commitment to not developing the shale oil resources. But anyway, all of this is to say that as those energy prices have kicked up, there is a perception that the net zero commitment is not something that can be met in a short enough unit of time to be compatible with keeping energy prices at a level that allows the AI sector to competitively develop in the UK and in Europe. So now there is a lot of questions about whether they're going to stick with that. It's an interesting issue because I find that it splits the parties in ways you wouldn't expect. So it's got, Blair, who's opposed to net zero, and, Miliband, who's for it, and Burnham being contested by these two figures. And then in the Conservative Party, people like Theresa May and Michael Gove are for net zero. And then right now it's not sensible for the front bench politicians to be for it politically. So, people like Kemi Badenoch are not. So it's a weird situation where both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are having almost the same kind of debate internally about whether the net zero commitment facilitates something like a Green New Deal and therefore jobs and economic growth, or whether it's placing a headwind on AI and the tech sector.
I mean, I guess we're going to have to see how the AI market fares in the United States since it's taken an interesting detour in the last week, but who knows? I mean, I don't know. I have thought a lot about this in terms of Europe because, data centers need both land and power, and Europe notoriously has neither. So, it's high density land, and their energy situation has been precarious for a while. Although I guess France is in better stead there because of their nuclear development. I guess this gets us to the constraints here, because what it really proves is geopolitically and thus even to some degree domestically that U.S.'s Western European allies are very, very constrained, and talks about leveraging China against the U.S. are going and doing more trade deals with BRICS, are even some grand Atlanticist deal with Canada and letting the U.S. rot, which a lot of American progressives thinks is happening, doesn't actually seem to be in the cards at all.
Yeah, part of the trouble is that the European Union brought back the fiscal rules, which had been suspended during the COVID pandemic. And the only exemption is defense spending. So if a state like Spain refuses to commit to the defense spending, it will just be bound now by the fiscal rules without the defense spending carve out that allows some states to smuggle various forms of investment through the fiscal rules.
Mm-hmm.
And outside of Spain, all of the other states have committed to the defense spending and are trying to find a way to make their state investments compatible with that.
Now, one of the things I think this is very interesting that I wanted to float by you. American military tech is notoriously overpriced, even for us in the United States. Like, it's one of our strategic disadvantages for dealing with Iran. Like, it cost us something like 100 times what it cost them to make a missile. Our missiles are way better, but that doesn't matter when it takes a few $1 million to make one and about a year. And there's no real way to increase productivity, even with massive amounts of automation. I am a little bit out of a loss to wonder how we're going to provide all this. I mean, and yet it's also clear to me that there is no real alternative that the Europeans and the British find acceptable, and like turning to the Russians, so that they're definitely not going to do that. Trying to peel China off from Russia and their strategic alliance, well, the energy situation makes that with the Strait of Hormuz makes that less likely. There just seems to be 1,000 cul-de-sacs that Europe is stuck in, and I'll just tell you, a lot of my audience gets mad when I talk this way. They think I'm some kind of American chauvinist or something, but I'm just like, no, Europe's got into 1,000 strategic traps that it doesn't seem to be able to deal with. And it keeps on bringing down governments right and left in the EU. I mean, like, you know, I'm beginning to wonder, will we ever have a very long sitting German government? Will a French president have a parliament that's in his own party again? I have no idea.
But this is a part why I wrote this piece, because I sympathize with the Allied situation. I'm not somebody who thinks that it's a great or wonderful thing to tear apart European social programs. I think that the healthcare system is important. I think that the railroads and the public transit, and I am a huge respecter of the European university systems. I went to European universities. So, you know, I have a lot of respect for a lot of the things that have been built out there. And a lot of Americans do. A lot of Americans get very into European and Japanese culture and visit and have connections to these places and admire all sorts of things about these ways of life. And of course, these ways of life were built with the help of the United States, which facilitated and created physical space in the post-war era for the construction of all of this stuff. So part of my aim in this piece is to think about how the Allies could turn this situation around. And the first thing that they would have to do is to get a sufficient level of energy autonomy, not for the purposes of breaking away from the United States and doing their own thing, but so that they can actually engage in trade wars, not real wars, but trade wars on a sufficiently strong footing that they might actually be able to extract. And not just trade concessions, I think, but the goal has to be political concessions, because the history of the last 10 years is that because the Allies don't have any kind of voice in DC politically, the United States takes foreign policy decisions that cause enormous disruption to European supply chains. And then this just puts the Europeans in a supine position where they have to buy LNG and they become more energy dependent. And now Japan as well. Japan recently made a deal to invest in Alaskan liquefied natural gas in exchange for gas shipments. And it looks like a nice deal for the Japanese, because since they'll have a stake in the company, they will be able to profit from purchasing their own gas effectively. But this creates a relationship of dependence that makes it harder for the Japanese to challenge the United States and demand things from the United States. Because Japan will be dependent on the United States for energy. So I think there needs to be a cultivation of energy autonomy, but not for the purposes of trying to break away, because the Allied states aren't in position to be able to successfully do that, but for the purposes of getting representation in DC specifically so that they can influence and affect what US presidents choose to do in foreign policy, so that you don't get into a situation where the manner in which the United States is choosing to handle Russia or handle Iran is imposing enormous energy costs, which which make the production of everything in Europe more expensive, which cause all sorts of European industries to lose ground and to look uncompetitive and non-viable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we definitely seen this with like Germany going from like the workshop of the Western world to WTF, man. I mean, basically, I know that sounds insulting.
And
but
what Merz has been saying recently, where he was scolding the population for not working hard enough, the problem is not that the Germans aren't working hard enough. It's that instead of buying all of this cheap Russian gas like they used to do, they now have to import this very expensive LNG.
Mm. Well, I think it's interesting because one of the things that your paper really wants us to do, and you began to lay this out in your last little bit here, is to reconceptualize what trade wars were actually for. I mean, because historically, 19th, early 20th, 18th century, even trade wars were either mercantile or they were about national decoupling and autarky. And the reason why we kind of turned against trade wars is it was true that when you do trade wars for this reason, you usually just have a war. Like it just becomes a straight up shooting war eventually. But you're kind of arguing that effectively what the Americans are doing is indirectly taxing the Europeans, and that the trade war kind of should be used not for this, kind of autarkic narrative, because we all kind of know that's not possible, particularly for just resource and land constraints reasons, particularly for the Europeans. I mean, so that what you actually suggest they should do is use trade wars to get concessions to integrate into like a more common tax market and more common regulatory structure, since the rules-based international order, in quotation marks, which has always been kind of imperial anyway, but has no longer been seen as in the interest of the people who set it up. And so the Europeans insisting on that leverage. I mean, I watch so many things, even from politically knowledgeable people in Europe, who find the Europeans' reliance on this to be an utter joke. And this leads me to the second thing that you contend, and this I really want you to talk about, because I haven't, I've studied ancient history, and I tried to explain to people the concept of social wars versus civil wars, and what those distinctions are, and how we flatten them out in the 20th century, and blah, 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 blah. But you actually think we should view this as like a social Cold War, basically.
Yeah.
Why is that? And what are we learning from this Roman social war model?
Right. So a civil war is a war among citizens of a polity. A social war is a war between a state and that state's allies. And it's a struggle for the purposes of changing the way in which that state relates to the allies. So rather than a war of independence, and in the last 100 years, the focus has been on thinking in terms of imperialism and therefore on independence and national self-determination, I'm proposing that we move past that and instead think in terms of a struggle which is about changing the relationship among the units. So it's a struggle which is not about breaking apart the social relations and eliminating them. It's about reconfiguring those relations and changing how they work. And I think in particular, you can use a social war to struggle for civil rights. So you can use a social war to get civil standing. And I think that ultimately, what the Europeans should be aiming for is, some stuff that might seem crazy, for me to just say it today in 2026. But I think they should be trying to get electoral votes. They should be trying to get senators. They should be trying to get members of Congress even. And they should be trying to get this without having to give on their policy autonomy, or they should be demanding that also as part of this, that many of the social programs that they have be taken up by the United States so that they aren't operating at a competitive disadvantage. Instead of the Europeans developing a budget that looks more like the American budget, the Europeans should be trying to make the American budget look more like a European budget.
Mm. And how do you think the Americans should handle? I mean, this is one of the things that I have often been pushing out now, because what we see now is tech sector development and its ties to the military industrial complex here, on our soil, leading to what would amount to, if they actually pulled it off, a social reproduction crisis that could not just divide the country. I do think if pushed to the extreme could lead to a possible civil war. Now I think that's usually now used way too early and way too hyperbolically, but I'm not saying it's likely, but the fact that it's non-zero actually concerns me. Why should Americans who care about this want this too? I mean, why should we give a shit about Europe at all?
I think if we look at our own society, we've reached a point where, what's the horizon for this project? What are the new ideas for what the United States can be? They revolve around a concentration of an enormous amount of wealth in the hands of a small number of tech companies. These companies using this wealth to develop an ever more elaborate military and intelligence gathering apparatus. This thing being the thing that you export to other states around the world so that they can copy elements of this. And, what do the Europeans buy from American defense companies? They buy, like Anduril border defense towers. They buy stuff so that they can securitize their population and they can copy various elements of American policy. This is not a very inspiring horizon for the future. And as long as states are stuck in this competitive game where it's about trying to win at the level of attracting tech companies to your territory and about trying to win at the level of fielding a military that's competitive with China's, if we're thinking in terms of geostrategic competition, it's really going to limit what we can ultimately do and become over the course of the century. All of the interesting ideas for what we could do with our technology to make life more livable and more pleasant have all come from the Allied states. All of the inspiring visions people have had since World War II of life have come out of Japan and Germany and France and the UK and the Scandinavian countries. We should find a way to get these kinds of ideas in dialogue with what we're doing in the United States, but it requires that we qualify the competition that's currently dominating and dictating how people think about what to do. And the way to do that, I think, is to create something larger that has more weight in the market, find ways to combine the market power of the Europeans with the Americans without ruining the European social model and destroying the things about Europe that are interesting in the process of doing that, which is currently, I think, the trajectory.
I mean, it does seem ironic that to save the European way of life, what they're doing is doing a military buildup, which of course is not as massive as the United States, because no one in their right mind would do that. But except for us. It does seem incredibly parasitic. And what I was thinking about these tech companies is they're not just parasitic on the worker, on rents, or whatever you want to say. They're also parasitic on other productive parts of society. And quite literally, actually. I don't just mean they're stopping investment. And no, they're dependent on the prior investment in that, but also limit our ability to do that, even in the private market, not just in the public one. And they're very volatile, as we are talking about right now. And their CapEx expenditures versus their revenues are insane. And this has been talked about a lot, but it really does seem that is there. And one of the reasons why I think a lot of these tech companies have gotten so interested in getting tied into the military is that's usually the one spending apparatus where you can be totally irrational. And so it's kind of a backdoor bailout in a lot of ways, although that has seemed to have limits, as Palantir has run into lately. But I do think that you're right, that there's a kind of bleak diagnosis on the horizon here. The most Americans seem to be able to imagine is Euro-socialism on a city level, which isn't really possible. Weird paranoid ethno-religious nationalism, and even undoing things like the 13th and 14th Amendment. Delusions about an AI god at the expense of hyperscale centers that use double the power of my state where they're going to build it. Although apparently that's running into problems now. And then paralyzing self-hatred and self-flagellation, where like no one can imagine what like if an American left did come to power at a national level, there is no realistic idea about like changing what the imperial apparatus is. It's either like we just don't engage with the rest of the world at all. So you have left Tucker Carlsonism or whatever, which is not even fair to Tucker Carlson, to be honest, or basically in a continuation of the status quo. And while you don't mention this, like you are seeing more of this with Israel. You know, more and more technological integration and stuff with Israel and not with Europe. I kind of think, you know, one of the things I was fascinated with about this is I was like, this does give us in the United States a way to start thinking about what we could do by aiding with this that isn't also this self-hatred or political negationism or whatever. Because the other thing I think we can see, and I don't know if you and I agree on the reasons why, but like even both right and left in the United States pretty much hates itself. And I'm sure there's, I would say there's political, economic reasons. You'd say there's structural reasons for that. We might even agree on some of them, but that maybe that by using trade as a leverage to not just change European foreign policy, but also American domestic policy, maybe that could give some people some hope of a more realistic grounding. Because, you know, the other thing is like the United States and China are in a Thucydides trap. So it's like the historical analogs are at the moment really quite bad. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, the United States needs more of a direct stake in peace, prosperity, and order in Eurasia. Right now, there are too many cases where the United States can go, we have liquefied natural gas in 2 moats. We don't have to care about what happens in Eurasia, or we can withstand a crisis in Eurasia for longer than the states based in Eurasia can withstand it. This creates, I think, a negative incentive. The United States has an incentive to disrupt and cause trouble in Eurasia because it thinks it can inflict more punishment on rivals than it will have to endure itself. If the United States had integrated politically to a much greater degree with some of the territories in Eurasia, those territories would give the United States a direct stake in maintaining peaceful and prosperous conditions for human beings in Eurasia. And it would become a lot harder for the United States to have all these wackadoodle, adventurous foreign policies that involve a lot of risk for people in Eurasia, but not much for Americans. So Americans don't take seriously what all of that will involve. And to give another example, in addition to Russia and Iran, the adventurism in Iraq kicked off, horrible refugee crises that devastated European countries and produced racial tension, produced religious tension, helped the right to reframe the post-2008 crisis in a way which was advantageous for it. And all of this is connected to an American foreign policy which thought, we can take an experiment in the Middle East and try something, and it won't ultimately cost very much, even if it fails, to the United States. And if there are costs, they'll be paid by other states in the region that are competitor states. This way of thinking, where the United States just doesn't take seriously risks that involve Eurasian lives, I think this is something that could end but it would require that the United States actually have skin in the game in Eurasia. The United States needs territory and people and GDP in Eurasia.
So, how do you think that would happen?
So I think the Europeans would have to recognize that they're in a situation where either they're going to be Americanized against their wills in ways which utterly deform their form of life, or they're going to participate in the Americanization process in a way that allows them to change what it means to be American, to actually, I think, revitalize potentially, if they were to play it right, the whole concept of being American. And one of the things that's happened recently is that American leaders have been making ethno-nationalist arguments that sound like, early 20th century European, identities. And meanwhile, the European leadership have been trying to transcend all of that and get past all of that. And they've been talking about being European like it's something anybody can be. So they've been thinking about being European like it's being American, while the Americans have been thinking about being American like it's being a nationality from a particular European country. So in some ways, what the Europeans are doing at this point is more American than what the Americans are doing. And so there is, I think, a possibility of interfusing these things together in a way that saves the American project from itself, and which would also therefore save the European project from being consumed by a bad kind of Americanism, which is the negation of the European. And I'm seeing a lot of people lately talk about European and American, as if these are two different civilizations. And I think this is just really unhelpful, because none of it's true in the slightest. The Europeans and the Americans have had so much to do with each other for so long. The legal systems, the political philosophy, there's been so much interchange culturally, between the two for so long, that treating them as if they're completely different civilizations is just not helpful. There's been a divergence in form of life, very much to do with the way in which the Europeans and the Americans have managed the whole post-World War II system and the way they've constructed it together. And they still have the capacity to construct something together if they think about themselves as doing that and take seriously that they can be part of constructing this if they think strategically about it. And for so long, the Europeans have been thinking about this too much in national terms. National European leaders try to influence the United States on the basis of personal relationships. Blair with Bush, Sarkozy and Obama. There are these efforts by specific European leaders to use personal charisma or something to influence U.S. foreign policy, and it's been very ineffective. The Europeans need a much more concrete connection to the United States to be able to influence its development and trajectory.
Now, I think this leads me to a couple of questions. You and I both know what the left response to this is going to be. That we are suggesting renewed imperialism. I consider myself a virulent anti-imperialist, and yet I don't know how the return to 19th century nationalism goes when you just kind of ignore how that led to the creation of the current system in the first place. And we now have nuclear weapons, killer drones, and chemical weapons that we couldn't imagine in the 19th century. So such conflicts that led to the creation of this system would potentially be human extinction level. Now, I'm not trying to scaremonger. I don't necessarily know that it would be, but I don't know that it won't be either. And I think that's fascinating when people, will talk about, a lot of left politics around, like, a lot of this is just, to me, I have long noted this tendency of people to have milquetoast politics domestically, but then be maximalist on foreign policy because, frankly, they have no effect on it anyway, and it doesn't really matter what they say. So maximalist moral posturing can get a whole lot of traction because there's literally no skin in the game and no accountability for it. And that goes in both anti-imperial and imperial directions. Like, you also have right-wingers saying insane shit because, again, there's no skin in the game and there's no accountability, and they're not going to have any effect on even our military industrial politics, much less our relationship to Eurasia at all. But it does seem to me that we get caught up in minor narratives and minor spats. The example you give in your paper is the Greenland event, which, I saw how even liberals responded to that, like, oh, we're going to end NATO. We're potentially tending towards world war. And, my immediate thought about that was, okay, I'll entertain that for a minute, but part of me thinks that there's no way the American Central Command would even let that happen. Like, not in a million years. So when I thought about that, I'm like, okay, this has to be for some other reason. You talk about the idea of kayfabe, that a lot of this is like illusionary fights that allow people to save face or pivot, basically
to legitimate other stuff. Right. If you have a kayfabe fight and you go, look, if we attacked Greenland, you wouldn't be able to defend it because you haven't invested in the defense of the Arctic. This is a spectacular way of saying, please invest in the defense of the Arctic as part of your NATO contribution. That's how I took it. It was a demand, a very pointed demand for NATO contributions in the form of Arctic spending. There were NATO summits, prior to that discussion, which were focused around Arctic defense spending as a collective endeavor. European countries made commitments to Arctic defense spending, but they were sluggish about allocating the funds and speaking as if, if you won't make these moves and defend the Arctic, then the United States will have to defend the Arctic for you. And it doesn't want to do that for free. So you'd have to compensate the United States, perhaps in the form of mineral rights in Greenland. This was a way of negotiating who was going to pay the cost of Arctic defense, particularly with regard to Greenland. And it was done in a ridiculous way, which had a stupefying effect on the public and caused a lot of Europeans to become all of a sudden very willing to support Arctic defense spending, which was precisely what the Americans had been asking for explicitly, in the year leading up to the whole thing.
I think this is particularly obvious with Canada. There's a harder problem when you deal with Mexico, but like us, for example, the current Canadian government has taken strong rhetorical stances against the United States, and even like pointed out some quote unquote imperial truths that I might even agree with. But then when you actually see what they do, they still capitulate to United States dominance because their economy is totally dependent on it. And the ability to pivot again to China or Europe as a consumer of last resort, or to integrate your infrastructure, well, that's really hard for Canada because oceans. It's and if we aren't backing up the blue water trade, that's an even bigger deal. And then it seems to me that like what you actually get is a lot of domestic anti-Americanism, which I can even understand because the rhetoric at hand, but it seems to be a smokescreen for renegotiating integration from a prior regime. But the same thing is going to happen. The integration is going to happen. And the relationship is quite different in Latin America, but it seems to me that Canada, for example, is even a more acute case of what you're talking about happening with Europe. And while it has really, really, accelerated Canadian nationalism, Canadian national identity, because, and I might anger, I have a profound Canadian listenership, but it might anger them when I say that most of their national identity is just they're not us. Which is in some ways, like you said, with this whole like idea that we are separate civilizations or even like really different national cultures. The Ontario accent is the same as New York's. With a slight difference on vowel pronunciation, but it's almost it's very hard, identical. When I lived in Korea, nobody, Europeans or Asians, could tell Americans and Canadians apart unless they asked us about our healthcare system. Yeah. And I find that fascinating because, like, you know, for a country whose identity, and I say this as a person who at one time had dual citizenship, is not the United States. Well, when the rest of the world approaches us, they're like, well, I treat you, yeah, I talk to you guys the same way because you basically share culture. I find this interesting, though. Why do you think people have been doubling down on the specter of early 20th century, late 19th century nationalism, geopolitically and economically, when it also seems like, why on the earth would you do that? You could more be easy. Like, the more you balkanize like that, the more easily you are rated by multinational corporations.
Yeah, I think it's because it's the thing that's readily available to hand. As people become discontented with the post-World War II order, because the post-World War II order failed to reform itself after 2008 in a way that would address the various grievances with it, and then began to break down insofar as the United States stopped cooperating with the WTO and began to force it to become dysfunctional. People have looked to historical examples, which is the usual thing people do. They start looking for what's the most recent time in which the things that are in the way didn't apply. So what's the most recent time in which the post-World War II system wasn't around and you could do things differently? It was the early 20th century. It was the 19th century. But this isn't the only other way things can be done. The post-World War II system is just one of the many different kinds of internationalist and supranationalist visions that we could have had at the end of World War II and that we might yet have going forward if we can open up our imaginations a little bit in terms of how we could structure things. Part of the trouble is that people don't seem to think that we can make anything new. All they seem to think that we can do is break what we have and then end up in competing nation states that are going to be in heavy security competition with each other. And when I say all of this, I am saying this out of love and respect for the Allied States. I would never promote any version of this which would make them become territories with no representation or without civil rights. The whole point of this idea is to expand the civil rights of Europeans and then to get Americans things like healthcare. That's the purpose of this.
I'm going to ask you a question that is not mentioned in your article, but it does interest me. Do you think this kind of thinking could help us avoid a Thucydides trap with China?
Yeah, so I think that the way that we ought to regard what's going on with China, I think comes out of this article for Isonomia. The title is "Trade Wars or Social Wars," which is a play on a book by Michael Pettis and Matt Klein called "Trade Wars or Class Wars," which I think is a really helpful book for thinking about why there's a trade dispute between the United States and China. There's an imbalance of consumption and production in the world today. There are some states that have been hyper-optimized for consumption and others that have been hyper-optimized for production. And the states that are hyper-optimized for consumption struggle to produce efficiently and at good prices. As you were saying, U.S. manufacturing struggles to produce efficiently. But conversely, the states that have optimized for production suppress wages and suppress consumption significantly. And this creates a mutual interdependence. And it also creates a lot of dysfunction internally within the two different entities that are imbalanced. And this was talked about a lot in the Euro crisis with regard to how Germany became this very dominant manufacturing base as the countries that were derisively and wrongfully called the pigs, including Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, those states lost their capacity, their manufacturing capacities, and were optimized to consume the things that Germany produced. And then this was moralized. Production was valorized as good, and consumption was condemned as bad. And then the pigs were framed as having been pigs, as having been slovenly, luxuriating states that have not consumed in an efficient way. But if the European Union were constructed in a way that created a fiscal debt union, then it wouldn't have been the case that this would have been so imbalanced. There would have been a way of managing those internal imbalances in a way that would not have caused horrible disruption or cuts to social services in Southern European countries. In much the same way, this imbalance, which gets moralized by people as the United States being decadent and not being able to produce, and China being virtuous and therefore having production advantages, this misses, for one, the total reliance of production upon consumption. Germany becomes a dominating manufacturing power because it creates a capacity to consume in Southern Europe. And in the same way, China has to create a capacity to consume in the United States to become a dominant manufacturing power. And conversely, the United States, to become this consumptive power, had to outsource a lot of production to other parts of the world, so as to free its economy up to become more financialized and to become more able to move resources around in a way that would facilitate continuing consumption. So if we're discontented with this because it's an imbalance which has had negative symptoms in both places, and the Chinese consume much less than they produce proportionally. Chinese workers are terribly underpaid relative to the value of what they produce, and have a standard of living that is much restricted relative to the value of what they produce, in terms of how much room they have, in terms of their the spaces in which they live. These giant apartment buildings that have these tiny flats in them. It's not adequate for them either in all kinds of ways. There, I think, needs to be more cooperation to bring about a rebalancing of these things. And if this cooperation is just done at the level of nation-state diplomacy, it's not going to be sophisticated enough to successfully resolve the commercial disputes that it's trying to adjudicate, because it's going to take it in terms of national interest, and that's going to create an appearance of opposed interests when really there are a lot of people in both countries that would benefit from certain common arrangements. But in both countries, there are entrenched interests that are driven either by, they benefit from the United States being very consumer oriented, like say Walmart, or in China, the various construction companies that benefit from China being very production oriented. These sectoral interests get in the way of a deal, of an arrangement that could be mutually beneficial and could actually make more sustainable the growth in both places.
One of the things I find very interesting is that what you're actually, to me, proposing is something like using the European-American allied relationship to create what would effectively be a mixture of Bancor from the Keynesian experiments that were never tried, which is to have a neutral, non-national global reserve currency. Because I think that would be required, frankly. And then also, what would be creation of a maybe more democratic international governing order, because the UN is not. I mean, the UN has got 1,000 cul-de-sacs in it. It's not very efficient at what it does. It's if you look at its primary mission, all it's ever really done is failed. I mean, seriously, I don't think that an honest leftist could really go to bat for the UN's historical success record. And the IMF has basically been good at imposing austerity at people, which has made it very unpopular worldwide. BRICS does not really seem to be a counter order, nor, despite what I hear, I'll be frankly, utopian MMTers in the United States say that they're going to just turn on their domestic consumption by money printing, which I'm like, A, no, they're not, and B, no, they're not, and C, that doesn't even make sense, because to have their money act like a reserve currency the way the dollar does, they'd have to do policy like the dollar does, and that would actually destroy their domestic production capacity. And if there's no one else to do that production capacity in the world, then the entire world economy falls apart. What the fuck are you talking about? Sorry for my choice language, but it really does seem ridiculous when
people are not thinking about it as a world system. They're thinking about it as if you have a closed system, or that you could create a closed system. Bingo. And it's too close to autarky, really.
Well, I mean, that's the problem with
monetarist autarky.
Right. That's the problem with my problem with MMT is it operates as if autarky was possible, and its basic model is an enclosed system. I mean, the whole coat check tokenized model is basically only possible the way it's described in very simple states, which, yes, kind of existed, I don't know. But,
Yeah.
you know,
And there are situations, there are moments in the world economy where you could do something that an MMTer suggests that you do and have it be functional. I think when many of these countries were at the zero lower bound in the years immediately following 2008, you could do a lot of monetary supported fiscal spending without running up unsustainable debts. But
can't do it now.
That's not something you could do in just any situation, certainly not when you have supply chain crises, elevated inflation rates. That's not something that the markets are going to wear. And even, the central banks don't cooperate with it. So you would have to capture the central banks, and you'd have to do that, against the resistance of the markets.
Right. And then also you have to deal with the fact that no country on earth, even a relatively research high one like the United States, has everything they need to run a modern economy. We don't have enough rare minerals without, I don't know, blowing up New York and mining underneath it or something. I mean, like, I'm kind of joking, but I'm also kind of not. So yeah, and yet, as you point out, like the idea that America and China are at complete odds is just not really true, since we need their mineral capacity and they need our energy. I mean, they can get energy from Russia, but the two things that you can say, despite all their massive planning and massive coordination and production, China's not food secure. Ever. Has never been, ever in its history, actually. And it's not energy secure either.
Yeah. And it doesn't have the consumer base, in part because you can't have everybody in China living in these very large houses with space for all sorts of consumer stuff. There just isn't enough space in most Chinese homes to purchase and store all of the things that Americans purchase and store. The suburban house with all of the rooms for the things that you buy that have been made all over the world. And the logistical system for distributing that, for moving it very quickly from place to place. It's a huge, and the financial system for financing the debt that Americans take on to be able to sustain buying all this stuff. It's very difficult for other states to achieve anything like the same final consumption per capita, which in the United States is in excess of 40 grand, final consumption per capita. And, in most allied states, it's around 25. And in China, it's around 10.
And there's been strong pushback from the CPC on increasing domestic consumption. Strong pushback.
Yeah.
So and I have some left MMTer friends who are totally baffled by this, and I'm like, I'm not, because they can't really. They lose a lot of their structural leverage right now if they do that, if nothing else, because we have leverage for being the consumer of last resort, and they have leverage for being the producer of first resort. Like,
yeah.
And
neither one needs to be minimized or treated, with disdain or morally, talked down. These are all important roles. It's just a little imbalanced. And if there was a mechanism for cooperating, then that imbalance could be overcome and rectified. But we don't have a mechanism. And because we just naturalize the post-World War II order, or we imagine just stepping out of it into the 19th century, these are really the only two things people do. There's no serious thinking about how to create structures which would actually allow the cooperation to be fruitful.
So I guess the immediate thing that comes to mind, though, is we have this atavistic nationalist system activated, I think, everywhere in the world. And in fact, as I pointed out when people were complaining about Trump, I'm like, it actually manifested in Europe and Asia before it manifested here. Before the global war on terror was even really fully winding down, we started seeing this turn towards right-wing nationalism in Europe because of the instability of immigration, from both climate change and geopolitical issues. And we also saw this from destabilization in the Philippines, leading to, a want for strong domestic law and order candidates. We saw this to some degree. We've seen it in Japan. not nearly to the extent we saw it in the Philippines, but nonetheless. And we've seen it a little bit in Latin America.
Yeah, there was a book by Joshua Kurlancic in 2013, I think it was, Democracy in Retreat, about all of that stuff.
Yeah. I suppose the thing is about like you kind of have this dialectic of like the way through this, this imperial morass is actually ironically not decoupling, but recoupling as equals. And I think, you don't say this, but I think it actually implies kind of a global skin in the game, which means new forms of cooperative governance that would be, you argue, kind of forced upon the Americans by trade war. As you pointed out with the social wars, that the Italians who lost militarily, but they still got the rights and stuff that they were asking for, because the cost and inconvenience of the war meant that the Romans were like, fine, you're citizens, to shut up. Like, to put it very simply, but it is effectively what happened.
Yeah, and little do they know it would totally change what it meant to be Roman and make it possible for people who lived on the Black Sea to become Romans.
Right. But one thing that I do wonder is, how deep do you think this provincialism goes, both in Europe and the United States, when proposing something like this? And do you actually think trade wars could mitigate against that atavistic impulse?
Yeah, I think certainly it could be done. What I'm talking about is possible at the level of just, could you do it? The question is, can people have this horizon or imaginarium? And not even just people, but the states in question. Can the states think about this as something that can actually empower them rather than weaken them? And to do this, we have to kind of get past the 20th century paradigm, which assumes that the way to get more autonomy is with a greater level of separation and political disintegration or devolution. A lot of the time, coming together allows you to have more sustainable differentiation at a lower level. That differentiation and plurality depends, however, on there being some level of unity at a top level. And I've written also a series of pieces on supranational federalism for the Strike Council that kind of explored these ideas of constructing a different kind of supranational entity, not for the purposes of crushing the autonomy of people, but for the purposes of qualifying the competitive drives, commercial competition with regard to capitalism, and then military competition with regard to war, so that it's possible for people to engage in forms of cooperation that currently look uncompetitive. I think the only way to make space for socialism would be something like this.
I have been struggling with this too, because the socialistic impulse, because of our anti-imperial drives, and in fact, anti-imperialism right now is probably the dominant form of socialist engagement, even amongst people who aren't particularly Marxist, Leninist, or anything like that. And in situations like with Gaza and Israel, I pointed out that as long as this remains a zero-sum game, one genocide or the other is inevitable. And that has never made people particularly comfortable. And I don't want to get too far into it, but I've actually thought like it would take an international coalition to enforce this and basically force integration in that particular area. But that's what it would take. No one really wants to do that. No one really wants to commit to it, although maybe that'll change as that conflict spirals into greater conflict in the region. I don't know. But this idea that national autonomy actually helps you sustain national cultures or whatnot, I think the experience of Yugoslavia, if nothing else, proves that that's not true. But
yeah, And people talk about neocolonialism. There's a recognition that having independence does not guarantee you the ability to differentiate or to take a different route. And oftentimes this is thought about too much in terms of just, the IMF, is intervening, or Western states are intervening militarily. But it's the structure. When you have a large number of competing states that are all trying to get investment, this compels them all to behave in broadly the same kind of way. If you have a large number of states that all have security concerns, this compels them to behave in largely the same way. You have to protect people from these things a little bit if you want to be able to see other kinds of behavior emerge. And I think the point that you make with regard to Israel and Palestine is insightful. If social relations don't tend to just sit where they are, if social relations aren't becoming civil relations, if there isn't political integration to come with economic integration, then economic integration tends to change the power dynamics and the relationships over time in ways that produce discontent. And then that discontent tends to result in attempts to revise the social relationship, which, if there's no civil political horizon, become hostile and militaristic. And so if we can't think in terms of the civil and the political at the level of the world anymore, because we no longer trust the post-World War II institutions, they've been seen to fail us or to impose neoliberal capitalism. So we're going to turn away from that. And we're not willing to think about any other way of structuring the world apart from breaking apart and taking apart the various types of relationships that have previously existed. The outcome of that is going to be hostility. I don't think it will necessarily be a world war or a civil war, but I think, at the very least, it would be something like Cold War II, with the United States trying to build a containment ring around China and trying to force states around the world to pick sides. And this would be terrible. It would be a horrible waste of human life, a horrible waste of our resources, just a terrible waste of our potential. And it will make this whole century and our whole lives so shitty and unpleasant. It doesn't have to be like this, but we do have to be able to avoid that kind of outcome, to be able to reimagine civil and political relationships with people who are not currently part of the national territory.
All right. I mean, this is one of these ironies where I have talked about, like, well, for example, we don't get to vote on U.S. Monetary policy either. It's controlled by the Fed, which is deliberately political, and liberals who previously hated that, now that they're not in power, love it. That's a whole nother discussion. But I do think it's quite interesting that, like, there's a real truth to the fact that, like, well, U.S. monetary policy affects the entire planet, and yet they don't have a say in it at all. And you just kind of have to hope that the Federal Reserve Board cares.
And their mandate tells them not to care. Their mandate tells them to care about unemployment and inflation in the United States. And if the United States doesn't include unemployed people in Europe or Japan, if it doesn't include the inflation rate in Europe or Japan, then the Federal Reserve is bound by its rules to not care. In fact, the Federal Reserve would be disobeying its Congressional Authorization Act if it cared. Yeah, and that's just such a tragic waste. And this goes back to so much of the instability in European politics is rooted in the collapse of Bretton Woods and the Nixon shock in 1971, which then sent the Europeans into a tailspin, figuring out how do we stabilize our currencies. It forced them to create the ERM, the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, forced them to create the European Union so that they could have the euro. And then this produced a kind of forced and rushed integration on the economic level that was never properly politically thought through. And that has continued to produce crises and antagonisms, and it's had a disintegrating effect on the Europeans over time. And this is something that the Europeans recognized when the Nixon shock happened as terribly dangerous for them. And they've been trying since 1971 to manage the consequences of that. And they're not able to do it on their own. It's a huge problem that the Federal Reserve and the Nixon administration took the view that the Europeans don't need to be considered.
I find this very telling. I mean, one of the great historical tragedies is, even though I think that Keynes floated this because it was better for British imperialism, that ironically I also think it would have been better for the world, if we had not a gold standard for exchanges between the allies that Bretton Woods was, but a true international currency, the whole Bancor idea, then I think that ultimately would have been better for everybody, including the United States, because we now have the problems of having to be basically, we can't really do our domestic one, it's not true that we're not productive, but we are too expensive to employ a lot of people in it. And attempts to alter that relationship, like with tariffs or whatever, actually break up our supply chains, which actually make us less productive, which has happened under the second Trump administration.
Yep.
So, the great irony there is actually somewhat similar to the irony you're talking about, that like one of the ways to save European life is, instead of like fighting Americanization, go, no, we're going to embrace it. And also we're going to actually make demands of you for once. Similar with us is that our attempts to renationalize our industrial production, which has been all abandoned by the Trump administration anyway, but it actually broke up our supply chains and made our own production harder, and has had many downstream effects. I do think one of the things that I really liked about your article is, like, we just have to admit that, imperialism or not, we're in a world system. You fight it worldwide, and you can do it peacefully or you cannot. But the cost to not right now, given the technologies that exist, is up to and including human extinction.
Yeah. And this idea that you have a revolution in one country and then export it, militarily, or you inspire a bunch of military showdowns in a lot of different places, it's a different question now versus back then. It really is. It's a much more dangerous kind of situation. You can't get people to take these kinds of risks to human life in a world with this kind of weapon system and with the legacy of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, World War II. People know about how badly out of hand these things can get. And one of the things people do all the time, they get dissatisfied with trade and with commerce and with social relations. So they go, okay, let's have military competition instead, as if that will be any better. And conversely, when people get defeated militarily, they go, okay, let's have commercial competition instead. You get stuck in this back and forth between the hostile, strange relationship and the social exchange trade relationship. But you never move beyond that ping pong back and forth between these two very limited kinds of competition that allow for only a very narrow range of behaviors. And people naturalize this and go, well, human beings just can't get along across these differences, as if it were fundamental to our cultures or fundamental to what we are biologically. But it's just because we've structured everything in this quite narrow way. And we're not able to see how narrow it is because we've been in it for so long.
I think that's really crucial. Although, I will tell you how much pushback I get when I tell people, like, the Westphalian nation state is fundamentally modern, and this has not always been true. Ethnocentrism has pretty much always been true, but like, that's not the same thing as a nation state. It's just not. And there's also been mitigating factors to ethnocentrism, so it's not like we always engage in it. And people are like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, if we always engaged totally ethnocentrically, frankly, we would be so inbred as a species, we would have already died out. Like, I mean, it really does, if you study kinship arrangements and, like, quote unquote primitive peoples, you start seeing, like, people, even when they're ethnocentric, start trying to find a way to be inclusive, because even if they don't have gene theory, they kind of know that if you only marry your cousin, you have problems in a few generations.
Yeah. What are the French? They're Celts and Romans and Franks and Vikings too.
Right. Yeah.
What are the British? They're Celts and Romans and Angles and Saxons and Vikings.
Right.
What are the Germans? They're Germans and Romans, and then different Germans, and and so on. And the Angles and the Saxons and the Franks are all originally Germans. Yeah, but people say, well, that's too far in the past. You can't reference any of that. None of that counts. Well, when do we decide that all of a sudden these are fixed, fundamentally different ethnic essences? In modernity. In modernity, people decided all of that. And that wasn't how anybody thought about things, prior to just really 200 years ago. Even the modern state, comes into existence before people think about it as a nation state. Natio in Latin is a much more general term that can just refer to any kind of group of anything. It's in classical Latin, it's a very flexible word.
Yeah, that's true. And ethnoids could exist with relative autonomy in a state. That's why you had stuff like ethnarchs and satrapies and whatnot.
Yeah, none of this there was never an assumption that the state had to be linked in any way to an ethnos or to a natio. And usually the assumption is that states would contain a lot of these things and that they could have relations on the basis of the civil law or on the basis of religious commitment at other points.
I mean, it kind of makes a point that I make that I will say kind of cuts against my otherwise diehard Marxism, which is like whiteness is constructed as a failure of Christendom, which I think is undeniably true, and that this is both super problematic, but also it was an attempt at inclusion that didn't really work until you got into the settler colonies in the United States.
Yeah, and Christianity is a supplement to Roman civil identity. And that's something to make up for that when it goes. And you're no longer able to politically sustain that because the territorial entity no longer exists.
I think that we kind of are stuck, though, both in the general public, but also in the left, because I will tell you that, like, in Marxism, the national question is a question that I feel like the Marxist answer makes the least damn sense. Because it's like, okay, we need to create nations, even when they didn't exist, so that we can build up their national civic infrastructure and create nation states, so we can then abolish the nation states through proletarian cooperation in an international. And just at this point, from the experience of the Soviet Union and the various Soviet national projects, we know that didn't work. Like, it did create some new peoples that really hated the Soviets that did not priorly exist. But it did not lead to this next step of like automatic integration, because the proletariat would, I guess, automatically see that they have joint common interest, which I also found fascinating, because you would have think 1914 would have proven that to everybody.
But yeah, and then even a lot of the Pan-African or Pan-Arab projects were undermined by this, by the large number of territorial states created out of the collapsing empires. Yeah. This is, one of the things that I like to bring up about the Middle East is that there are like 3 states in the Middle East that would exist independently of the breakup of the colonial empires, probably Egypt, Turkey, and Iran. And all of the other states are created out of the territories of these empires and exist mainly to get in the way of those 3 states and to prevent them from constructing larger political entities. And nationalism is one of the things which restrains and prevents Egypt and Turkey and Iran from cooperating with people living in the other states and frustrates any kind of Pan-Arab project.
Yes. I mean, people think about like they don't think about, but they should think about, because I don't even think a lot of Americans know that this even happened. The Pan-Arab state attempt between Egypt and Syria. Which lasted not very long.
Right. Frustrated both by the fact that Israel exists in between the 2 states, but also by the fact that the Egyptians approached it with this Egyptian nationalist attitude that made it very difficult for the cooperation with the Syrians to be sustained.
So I guess this brings us back to, for me, the lack of domestic imagination in the United States, because you and I both get called doomers all the time. We've talked about this before because, I keep on telling people, no, that won't structurally work. No, that won't structurally work. No, you can't build socialism just in New York. City, not even New York State, just New York City. There are rational imperatives why this won't work. And by insisting on it and putting so much emphasis on it, populistically or whatever, you are creating the incentives for a massive backlash.
New York City is a financial hub that relies on its integration into the whole global capitalist system. And it has an enormous amount of existing infrastructure, which heavily limits what kind of form of life you can have.
Right. Well, I've also pointed out, though, this is also why you can't export the New York model, the New York DSA model, for example, to the rest of the country, because I'm like, part of this is based on the fact that Mamdani has inherited, even though Eric Adams did try to finish destroying it, a fortish infrastructure that survived even the near bankruptcy of the city in the 70s, that has never existed in the Southeast and in the far West, and including that is in California. So this infrastructure that you try to export to other areas, electorally or whatever, will not work. Beyond that, there are two major threats to Mamdani. One, if we're quite honest, his entire ability to balance the budget, which you may have seen on social media, progressives and leftists celebrating as if it was some kind of miracle. I'm like, okay, it's a re-amortization trick that you can do once. It's bailouts by the New York State government, and then it's hoping that Trump doesn't crush you by being more punitive. And what it misses, and I think I've been trying to get people to look at this, and even friends of mine who I normally consider very smart don't want to. But I'm like, London proves to me that this idea that because there has been a legal restriction on stock trading that creates a monopoly on the New York Stock Exchange, we know that's ending. The New York Stock Exchange itself has moved branches out to Texas, knowing that there's going to be competition there. Once that happens, and we're not even dealing with capital flight to another country, we're just dealing with capital flight to another city and state.
Yeah,
right. Of which there is nothing legal you can do.
Right.
That the entire tax apparatus of New York City collapses almost overnight.
Yeah, there's nothing that compels the financial services sector to be concentrated in New York City. And it's one of the easiest sectors to move from place to place. It's, office space. It's not something that requires a lot of large scale industrial engineering to move around from one place to another place.
Right.
And it's not going to happen. There's not going to be a movement of the financial sector out. What's going to happen is that he's never going to do anything that will actually cause them that level of grief. He's going to do a lot of performative stuff, like talking about taxing people's second residences that raises paltry amounts of money that poses no serious threat to that sector. It's going to look good on social media, and he's going to try to string enough of those kinds of things together that people don't notice that substantively very little actually changes about the city.
I mean, for me, it's like Bill de Blasio, but with pink paint. Which, look, I would rather have Bill de Blasio than Andrew Cuomo. I know that you actually would not, but I find this very frustrating when I'm like, there's an austerity wall coming very quickly, and you guys are ignoring the municipal bond problem, that you can only re-amortize these pension things once. You can only fix bad deals once. And the entire way this is structured is dependent on revenues going up in New York City. And there is no larger economic indicator that is going to happen.
And it's not like you could just build a bunch of data centers in New York City. All the land is being used.
Right.
I've always said, if you were going to try local socialism, the thing to do is do it in places where there's land that's undeveloped or not very expensive, that you could develop in some way that would be impressive to the people who live in the region.
Yeah, here, Utah, Wyoming,
or Indiana. Yeah,
where you also don't need that much of a political threshold to get political power. Like,
right, where the Democratic Party is not well organized, and it would be easy to, but they don't try these things because they are not willing to talk to the people who live in these places in such a way that they would want to take part.
I mean, it does also mean with dealing with some of the uglier parts of the American system in the late 20th century that no one wants to talk about. Like, how did we offset deindustrialization going all the way back to the 60s? Prisons, military bases, and then the subsequent petit bourgeois apparatus to service those, which does make a lot of those places pretty politically reactive. I'm not going to lie. But it's not because people want that. I mean, if you talk to a lot of rural people, it's not like they don't want the prison there. They just know if they don't have it, they don't have any jobs.
Nobody's offered another development model. And what the Obama administration saw was that the rural counties saw negative job growth during a recovery that they were supposed to be grateful for. Right. So that's what they are expecting out of people they're told are on the left. And until somebody demonstrates an actual capacity to generate growth in these places, why is there going to be any trust?
And the other thing that you and I have both talked about, and you are pro-federation, even at like a supernatural national level. I am maybe a little bit more centralist, but I admit that we live in a federalized society and country structurally, strategically, in a bunch of ways. And I'm just like, you can't do national politics from two metropoles in a place where you have 50 different subpolities and thousands of different subpolities that you have no influence over, no ways to affect the legislature from. And yeah, you might get a mayor. I'm not just talking about Mamdani, but you might get a progressive mayor. Yes, he wasn't endorsed by the DSA, which is more just their structural deniability claim. With Brian Johnson in Chicago, which has been a disaster because he didn't understand the bond market. Our Mayor Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, that went nowhere because Jackson doesn't control even it's a lot of its internal municipal spending. It's held by the state legislature. And
that's the other thing that happens very quickly. Even before anybody would leave New York City, they would complain to Albany about anything that was making them think about doing that. And then there would be a possibility of the autonomy being rolled back.
Right. So, what we see is because Mamdani is a good politician, he's going to frustrate his own base because they're going to expect him to do more. And then the ones who don't will be like, oh, well, they're so used to neoliberalism, no one's going to hold them accountable for that. I've literally seen that argument made. And I'm like, one, why should you want that? Like, why do you want, we don't hold anyone accountable for not delivering on their promises because they nominally were a member of the DSA and, gotten a progressive stack once. Why would you want that? They don't care
if he actually does anything. They just want him to serve as an inspiration to other candidates like him. And then, just keep delaying and putting off the expectation that something actually get done so that people see any sort of proof of concept indefinitely.
Which has been the failure of progressive politicians since the 60s. I mean, we could even say that like it killed LaGuardia in New York all the way back in the FDR administration, because when the New Deal money ran out, so did his programs. Like, I just find this to be incredibly politically naive. And also it's, at a time when people are talking about anti-imperialism, and I'm like, yet you seem to be, one of the big, a lot of things that people get mad about Mamdani is stuff that like, he signaled something to the Zionist group that said he wasn't totally hostile to them, even though he's an anti-Zionist, or, he can't get rid of Tish or whatever else. And I'm like, okay, yeah, he looks like a chump because Tish is playing him. I'll give you that. But beyond that, it's also like, well, what do you expect him to do? Like,
yeah. And the sad thing is cities could be really interesting. Cities could differentiate and do all kinds of different things if they had a reliable capacity to tax. at a rate that would allow them to actually have enough resources to try stuff. But the only way that you're going to have an environment where cities can do that is to have some protection against the competitive impulse to try to compete for highly mobile jobs, highly mobile tax base, highly mobile wealth. And that requires cooperation at a much higher level. But trying to do it in the cities when you've not established any of that, indeed, where the position of the higher level units is that the lower level units should be pushed into competition for the purposes of homogenizing them and getting them to behave, it just conflicts fundamentally with the way the whole world system is presently structured. Not to mention the way the US federal government is presently structured, or the state government in many of these states.
Well, I mean, I've even pointed out that you might have progressive countries suing New York for bond promises because they can do that. Because once you introduce bond reallocation, which has been a real limit in like Chicago, you open yourself up to international trade courts. It even goes beyond domestic law.
Yeah.
And people just will say stuff to me like, well, that's priced into bond price. I'm like, what are you talking about?
The assumption is that no one will ever do anything like that because it would be economically insane. It's not priced into anything. That stuff is considered non-credible, crazy people policy. The assumption is that no one will do it. If somebody does try to do something like that, it completely stuns the market and there's a run. Like when Liz Truss tried in the UK to do something wildly out of step. It's possible to do stuff that's different, but you have to create the preconditions for that. And that's not something that can just be insisted on at the level of a city or a national government.
Yeah. It does require international cooperations, because things that even people imagine on the left, like when they get all super Bonapartist, like, okay, well, Bernie could come into power and just forgive all these debts. And I'm like, no, he can't. Again, he cannot. And you're like, what? And I'm like, no, he'd be driven into an international court within a few weeks, and also Congress would do it, and you probably even see him get impeached. I don't know what you're thinking.
At no point did Bernie Sanders say he was going to rip up the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. That was never part of the discussion. That was all just sitting there in the background, and nobody wanted to ask about it or talk about it.
Well, I mean, and it also deals with another thing that you and I have talked a little bit about, but like you and I both believe in socialized healthcare. We think it's super important. I, as a person who just got another surprise medical bill today, I really think it's super important. But at the same time, I have to admit that, like, when I hear people talk about, like, okay, we talk about the big beautiful bill and what it's doing to the healthcare sector and how many jobs it's going to cost and how much it's going to cost the U.S. job economy, and I just go, okay, what do you think actually rationalizing the cost structure of socialized medicine would do? It would be even more devastating to the job market in healthcare. I'm not talking about, just all the insurers and all that, although you'd have to do something with that too. I'm talking about all the logistics jobs. I'm talking about all the bureaucratic oversight. I'm talking about these and instead what you're seeing is financial consolidation that shouldn't even be legal, where you have single parties owning all parts of the supply chain, and occasionally you'll get someone on the left who's read some early 20th century or late 19th century stuff about socialization, say, oh, but that's good. That monopoly means they're easier to seize, and then we can just seize that monopoly and go about it. And I'm like, okay, that was this theory in Germany in the 1920s. What happened?
Yeah. And one of the things that nobody talks about is when the socialized healthcare systems were being created in the post-war era, healthcare was a much smaller percentage of GDP. So the amount that you had to compensate people as part of constructing these systems was much, much lower as a percentage of GDP. When you get something that's 17% of GDP, either you need an incredible amount of money, or you have to engage in a lot of austerity as part of taking the thing over. And if you're going to do that, then you have to somehow deal with the unemployment that creates. You have to make replacement jobs. You have to do something else. That's going to be costly too. Now, I think all of that is worth doing and that it can be done if you think seriously about it. But when people act like you can just, magically all of a sudden have, the government take on 17% of GDP, where currently it's only dealing with, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP. That's just an enormous amount of the economy to deal with. If you don't have a mechanism for being able either to raise the tax base to do that, or a mechanism for being able to manage the unemployment that it generates if you cut down on the layers of waste. And I used to write pieces where I think through this. I think that I wrote Requiem for a Dream about Medicare for All, for Sublation a little while back. And, I think you could cut healthcare in the United States to something like 14% of GDP, but this would be difficult. You'd have to find something to do with the 3% and with the large number of people that are employed. It's doable, but it's much more doable if you do it in cooperation with other states. In other parts of the world, you get common tax rules that allow you to raise the level of tax necessary without driving out your jobs and your capital. It requires a much more serious interest in coordinating with other people than has heretofore been shown by anybody.
Right. I mean, this includes the UK, which you have experience with, in Canada, which I do, where I'm like, well, I mean, Canada is literally promoting suicide as opposed to paying more to provincial healthcare systems. And
if you
that's
don't
not even deniable at this point.
You have to find a way to sustain the tax base for it. And at this point, because it's unthinkable that you'd raise the tax rate, the obsession is with growth, and therefore with accommodating the tech sector, or in the case of Canada, accommodating the shale oil sector to generate enough growth to be able to sustain the health service.
I agree with you. It pretty much can't be done. It cannot be done domestically. There's no singular domestic constituency for it that has any power in a concentrated way. Yes, there's a diffuse demand for it. There's been a diffuse demand for socialized medicine since the fucking 50s. But it takes a lot to do, and the other thing that I have talked about is as I've talked about this before, and people do not like when I talk about this, but it's the same point you made. It would have been easier to do in 1930 and set up, but even the countries that did it, Britain, Canada, etc., have run into structural problems.
Right, because at this point, the tax base that you need to be able to sustain a good, high-quality service is not compatible with the level of growth that they're trying to attract. So you get into a lose-lose situation where either to promote growth to fund the health service, you have to cut the tax rate to the point where you can't fund it, or to raise the tax rate to fund the health service, you lose the growth that's necessary to fund it. And so as the health service degenerates, they have to make all these compromises and privatize all of these elements. And at this point, in Britain, the political consensus is that this is just going to happen one way or another. Everybody in the Labour Party is for some level of NHS privatization and for further cuts to public services. The only question is how quickly to do it, what sort of plan you should have, the degree to which you talk about it in public. It's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, you don't have to look far for a dystopian future in America. You just have to look at Britain and just scale it up.
And credit to the Brits, they talk very explicitly about the problems that they face. This debate recently between Starmer and Blair, where Blair writes the 5,000 word thing and Starmer writes the Substack piece. And, then people like Theresa May and Gove and, Miliband, they're all saying different things about, net zero and whether it's compatible with having the growth and having the AI and the tech companies support to achieve the growth targets. It's very honest and open discussion of macroeconomics by front bench or former front bench politicians in the pages of major newspapers, the quality of the discussion in the UK is still significantly higher. It's under siege because the Reform Party and the Green Party want to Americanize the hell out of the political discourse in the UK and turn it into slopulism. But right now, still in the Conservative and Labour parties, there's still enough vestigial norms of having a real conversation about what you're actually going to do that involves some level of public comment, that you're able to actually see some of these debates. They actually still occur in a place where you can look at them and it's possible to track them. In the States, the conversation has become so empty with regard to all of this.
I do want to ask you, why do you think it is that there are no longer, like, for example, I have all my critiques of elite discourse around economics, but I used to be able to read the Wall Street Journal and get the kind of news you now have to go to the Financial Times for. When I go to the Wall Street Journal now, not just in the editorial page, which has always been batshit, but Chomsky back in the 90s would say, "Oh, but read the actual reporting." Now the actual reporting is ideological.
Yeah, the FT has become, Antioch for being able to have a newspaper that talks about the economy.
Right.
Yeah, it's the last economy. City. Yeah.
And leftists mistake it for a left-wing newspaper because it actually talks about economic issues in a real way. And I'm just like, it's not enough.
They know that leftists read it. Sometimes they do include little sops.
Yeah.
Little winks and nods. They like to do that sometimes. They know that it's part of their subscriber base.
But it is. I did find it very interesting, and it was very telling that and I this is not true for the general British newspapers. I think in general British newspapers are really bad, but not the political discussion parts of it. By that I mean like the debates you're talking about between politicians that happen on the press, and also I will say BBC and channel British television anchors and whatnot are willing to take oppositional stances to politicians in ways no one in America is, because of fear of losing their audience, because they're effectively audience captured. But the audience actually is so effectively politically captured that,
in part because the MPs are always competing for leadership positions and front bench positions, so you can attack a particular person and have it be to the benefit of other people in their party. So it's not as if you attack a Democrat, you must be helping a Republican. If you attack, say, Andy Burnham, you're potentially helping Keir Starmer, you're potentially helping Wes Streeting, you're potentially helping somebody else, maybe Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, who might think that they ought to ultimately end up in the chair. So there's ways to do it that still seem to be potentially to the benefit of other members of the political class.
Well, I think this incentives is important to think about, because you and I have both also been on a kick where I hear about utopian fixes to the two-party system. Like if we only had ranked choice voicing, or if we only had mandatory, the big one 10 years ago was mandatory voting. And I'd be like, Ireland and Australia, their problems about these things are not as acute as ours, but they still exist. They still have depoliticization. They still have anti-politics. They still have a vulnerability to slopulism. It is not fixed by these reforms. It isn't exacerbated by it. I'm not saying these reforms would be bad, but they don't fix what you're saying they're going to fix.
Yeah, all the same trends are still affecting all of these states. The European states all have these programs under siege by the competitive international environment with no political integration. It affects everybody, no matter what reforms you have. And one of the things that drives me crazy is that people will blame the lack of these reforms. And then they'll always say, well, of course, those reforms wouldn't be enough anyway. And they always try to have it both ways. And they'll often write pieces, talking about how horrible and terrible it is that in the European countries, things are being rolled back. And they'll say at the same time that those reforms would be the silver bullet if you enacted them here. And then they'll say, well, of course, it wouldn't be a silver bullet. You would still need to do all sorts of other things. So should people be caring about this? Should it be a priority? there's no serious thinking about it. And I think it's in part because people tend to just write whatever it is that they can sell currently to one of the magazines. If there's a moment right now where people are looking for excuses or explanations for why this or that candidate didn't win, something about dark money will always sell with one of the magazines. Something about the voting system will always sell for one of the magazines when a candidate loses an election that people think should have won as an excuse for why they lost.
Well, even the Sanders campaign has dark money at this point. What are you guys on? I've covered all the weird money that shows up in Our Revolution and whatnot, post Our Revolution super PACs and the way they intersect with millionaire and billionaire money even now. And I'm like, well, this seems to me to be frankly a revitalization of the status quo by pretending you're opposing it. And it's not politically viable. And I agree with you. People think, oh, well, you mean raising taxes on everybody. I'm like, to some degree, yes. But actually, what I really mean is stopping tax competition. And it infuriates me that these data centers are getting sweetheart deals where they can just farm things and then not pay local property taxes.
Yeah, not just tax breaks, not just subsidies, but oftentimes actual spending that's done to facilitate infrastructure spending, to facilitate and make cheaper the building of stuff. People were complaining the other day in British politics about infrastructure spending more than £1 billion to facilitate the building of a universal resort.
Yeah, and it's maddening to me. I mean, in the United States, we now have more money being spent on AI infrastructure than on any other infrastructure at all. Like I've been pointing out, there's a capex weakness in this. People will take me as saying this as somehow I'm anti-AI. I'm actually not. But I am anti the way AI is being implemented and rolled out and thought through, because I, like you, think this could be a radical technology that we could all benefit from in real ways. It is not teleologically oriented that way because it's not designed to be right now, but it could be. We could set up these data centers smarter. We could start trying to deal with the energy cost, by putting efficiency incentives into the learning models themselves, as the Chinese did because they were forced to, a DeepSeek. There's all kinds of things we could do. We're not doing them. And then, my favorite cockamamie thing that I see right now is seeing Sam Bankman-Fried get on stage with Bernie Sanders, not for the nationalization of AI, which you and I both know would not happen for a variety of structural reasons, even though I would support it if it could happen. It's not going to, not in the current environment. But this 50-50 shared stake thing. And I'm like, okay, so that's just going to tie us all into managing data centers at the expense of the rest of the economy in some ways, because now we have to keep it profitable to keep both stakes up. And the AI infrastructure is already tied in the military industrial complex like crazy. Yeah.
Does the state need more incentive to hyper focus on that particular sector at the expense of everything else?
Yeah, it just seems like this sounds good if you're thinking only one step ahead. And what I liked about your article about thinking about trade wars and social wars is it is really about thinking 4 or 5 steps ahead instead of just one. Because I think right now, and this is even true for capital, I've thought a lot about the liberal imperative on capitalism and its long-term development and all that, and how it seems like now, because of some very technical things that I could explain in Marxology, but I won't, because I'll spare my listeners who have to deal with that all the time anyway. That we don't really have a good vision for profitability in ways that would help the general economy. And I mean that literally by why the AI numbers went kablooey in the last few weeks. And it's because there is positive job growth. And now it's positive job growth in shitty jobs that can't outpace inflation, but there was positive job growth. And then the AI market started tanking immediately. And I was like, that plus a little bit of pushback on the SpaceX IPO from the S&P 500 seemed to just crack, this CapEx problem. And then all of a sudden, it's like I was telling people, well, it is cold comfort that we have to rely on the rationality of certain sectors of capital for stability to stop self-cannibalization at this point. Like, and we're selling that to the future, but then, I'm like, do you really expect though people to just, right now, the best argument against AI is it's not actually more efficient than human labor. And that's right now mostly true depending on the sector you're talking about. That won't always be true. And I do wonder what people think that means.
Yeah, and part of the trouble is people think, that what we're talking about when we say human labor is what's fundamentally valuable about human beings. So when people say, "Oh, AI can do this work," they seem to be devaluing what human beings can do. But I think people have to remember that a lot of the jobs that currently exist do not make full use of human capacities. They are predicated on human beings who have, can be stunted in various kinds of ways, but nonetheless can do a limited kind of functional job because they have a limited kind of functional education that has trained them to do these limited things. Mm-hmm. A lot of the work that we're talking about getting rid of is not work that allows for full human flourishing or development. So it could, in principle, be a good thing.
Yeah, I think this is important because I've talked about, yes, I do agree that the way we're currently using AI leads to cognitive degeneration. Here's the thing. That's because we're using it in that particular way. I mean, there's also truth to the fact that just having books means that I have less of a memory than an ancient.
Right. You don't have to memorize an oral, the whole text of the Odyssey and be able to repeat it. They used to really value that, even when writing was a thing, when it wasn't completely widespread. Reciting poetry was a huge part of ancient education.
Right. And also people like, oh, poetry. I'm like, no, dude, poetry was like how you taught people how to farm. Like go back and read those bucolics and whatnot. They weren't all just about celebrating nature. They were also telling you how to do animal husbandry and grow shit.
Yeah, and it's in part because poetry, helps you remember. To make it beautiful helps you remember these important things.
Right, and I tell people that I do agree with you that AI is doing the things you're saying it's doing right now. And I don't think it's worth the current power, water, and energy cost, but the idea that it has to be this way is also a limiting, so our options are to either forego this technological development altogether and go back to more tedious forms of human labor because it's more labor consumptive and that somehow that'd be good, or to continue developing it the way it's being developed, which is going to be a massive energy suck and is not yet currently all that super helpful for very many things. And I hate to tell you guys that this is to come back to your point of your essay. You also can't control this in one nation. As long as this is a national project, you're going to be in a red grain with nations that do use it. You would have to come up with an international framework for how to incorporate and limit this. And that requires such an international framework to exist, which is why all these radical decouplings and whatnot don't work for me. I was thinking about this when I was talking to someone earlier today about, degrowth eco-socialism. I consider myself an eco-socialist. People mistake me for a bright, developmental eco-socialist, and I'm not. But I also say well, do you really think you're going to be able to control the environment by municipal decentralized agriculture, because that is what a lot of people put on offer. I was actually laughing that despite all the Marxology, Kohei Sato just used Marx to arrive at the same thing Murray Bookchin did 30 years ago.
Yeah. And, meanwhile, you have people who are currently hungry in Sri Lanka because of rising oil prices, making it difficult for them to get food. These are people who just don't exist in these discussions. They're not taken seriously as mattering. The stuff that happens to them is not treated as important. It's just terrible. The level of talk about that, because it's a global food system that requires an enormous amount of yield to have prices on the current market system that are low enough for people in developing countries to be able to buy food for their kids.
Right.
None of this is seriously reckoned with.
No. I mean, like the idea that we're going to somehow overnight move, I think the most strange one is the half-Earth socialism possibilities. Like, we're going to rewild half the planet. How are you going to do that? We're going to mandate global veganism. How are you going to do that when you've also decentralized agricultural production, so you can't really move stuff from one place to the other? And there's plenty of regions where veganism really isn't possible without a global food chain. You're like, I'm sorry, it sounds like you might accidentally Pol Pot Cambodia like half the planet. And
to your point about the AI, the only person who has tried to say anything about how AI might be governed at a global or international level is the only person in high politics who runs an international structure, which is the Pope.
Yeah.
And we have such a dearth of imagination at the international level that the Pope is running at a plus 30, net rating, simply because he's talking about, at the level of the planet, doing something about this.
Right. And while it's read as like Ludditism, he's not even saying that. He's just...
no. Many people have criticized it from the other direction, that it's too positive about AI because he doesn't regard AI as something which can feel love or can engage in choices about final ends. So he doesn't see it as a threat to be able to do those things. So the people who think that AI is conscious regard him as being naive or a useful idiot for the Skynet.
Oh boy. Oh man, the consciousness debates about AI just make my brain hurt. Although ironically, sometimes I wonder if, like, now you guys have proven to me that maybe people aren't conscious, but that's obviously an absurd premise. But anyway, I do think though, I really like this article, not just because I want people to think about what internationalism would look like, and maybe even a reframing of what anti-imperialism is, other than decoupling. Because the one thing I will say is no power has ever wanted decoupling for very long. I mean, like, how did China become the miracle that it became in poverty reduction after the collective period did not work? Although it wasn't as bad as people said it was, I will say that, but it didn't work. Was integrating into the global financial economy, and then people will be like, oh, well, they did it on their own terms. Like, yeah, they did, but they still integrated into the global financial economy, and you have a communist state with billionaires in it. I don't know.
And they were welcomed in. They were welcomed into the WTO. They were given, they were welcomed by Richard Nixon. There was an attempt to bring them in part because of concern about the Soviet Union and belief that bringing them in would be helpful. It did generate an enormous explosion of cheap consumer goods in North America in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, which was part of what allowed for the delegitimation of the Soviet Union, because it wasn't able to produce cheap consumer goods internally, and it didn't have access to a market to which it could outsource, and it remained in hock to its heavy industry, which it couldn't displace, and et cetera, et cetera.
And Keir got caught up in IMF loans. I mean, I think also that it allowed American development. It allowed neoliberalism to seem viable in some ways, because the cheap commodities that it was able to produce after, the globalization of the currency also enabled us to be able to ignore service inflation.
Yeah. And this, I've been trying to, for a while, get people to understand China's growth is part of neoliberalism. China is neoliberalism. It's just a part of neoliberalism that we don't talk about or think about as part of neoliberalism. But the whole transformation of China occurred in and through what we call neoliberalism out here.
I would even say it happened through both neoliberalism and ordoliberalism. And I think people underestimate how severe it was, because I'm like, they stopped funding the education of girls in the countryside, guys. Like, it was pretty severe.
And it used to be that neoliberals would argue for neoliberalism on the basis that it was lifting people out of poverty in China. They used to explicitly argue for it on that basis.
Right. And also, leftists used to explicitly critique China on that basis. See David Harvey's book that he's now recanted that part of. But it just seems to me, I don't want to get too deep into like inter-left stuff, but there seems to be like this attempt to pretend that like the tensions in the communist sphere of the world didn't happen, so we can just pretend that like China's socialist and is not implicated at all by neoliberalism today, or
didn't help that it's been Maoist the whole time.
Right. Yeah, it didn't help with the global war on terror and like all kinds of stuff. And also that they were super copacetic with the Soviet Union, except for that dirty Khrushchev, and that's the only problem that ever happened. And they totally want undermining socialist movements in other countries to help the Americans as part of that trade-off.
Right? These are weird sectarian groups that have fringe views that require ignoring things that you can discover in a Wikipedia article.
But they do. I will tell you, amongst Zoomers, they have a lot more important. I will say they don't have the sticking power. So you see these things come up, and these like fads of like ignoring certain trends will pop up, fly through the internet, and like you'll have 20% of weird radicalized Zoomers picking it up, and then they will kind of, I don't know, read a book and realize that it's more complicated than that.
Yeah,
and they they won't say anything about it. So
I put my faith in the ability of the young people to read. The young people who can read will never stick with this kind of stuff for very long, because it's too brain dead and it conflicts too much with stuff that you can easily discover by opening relatively simple, easy to read books, not even anything complicated. The people who actually will fall into this stuff and get suckered by it are people who are not going to be of any use to any movement in any case anyway, because their ability to think about stuff and read and engage with anything is so limited that they're really just being conditioned by watching videos on the internet.
I am going to ask you a question where this area is an area where I pick up a lot of points from Freddie DeBoer, but diverge from him because he doesn't think there's a problem, and I do. I agree with him that it's not merely an educational problem, that it's a social problem, but I think it's a severe problem, and that is like literacy of all sorts, not just traditional literacy. I mean, media literacy, numeracy, etc., is in rapid free fall. And before people just, it's stupid Americans, it's worldwide. With China being kind of an outlier, but only kinda. It's still happening. There's just not a severe.
Yeah. And even in the places where it hasn't happened to the same degree, the education systems in these countries are under heavy pressure to adapt reforms that will have these effects. Keir Starmer is considering equipping all of the kids who are falling behind with AI assistants on tablets. And none of this is proven, and there's no reason to think this will help any of them, but it will generate revenue for the tech companies, and it's an attractive sop to them, and it makes it seem like he's doing something about the problem. Yeah.
I just love how
there is a serious educational issue, very serious, particularly for anybody who's interested in a kind of mass politics. If you're an elite theorist who thinks that you can get what you want with some, tiny number of people who are able to read, then it's a different story. But for anyone who's got any interest in anything large scale, it matters greatly that we've got, a population that is becoming less literary, that is becoming more dependent on the video form, and also which increasingly can't even watch full-length movies or full-length sports games, but is limited in terms of the attention span to short-form video. That's the next level. And the sports leagues are already concerned about this. They can't get kids to watch full-length basketball or baseball games. And how do you monetize the short form video content for these sports leagues, which they've typically given out for free, imagining it will get people to watch full length games and to pay for cable and pay for streaming services and so on? It's a major problem, not just the pivot to video, but the move to short form video, which no one has been able to compete on without producing extraordinarily stupid content. If you look at what dominates Instagram or TikTok or YouTube Shorts, it's incredibly thick, very, very dumb stuff that is able to compete within the very short form.
Absolutely. I can tell you this from experience, because I tried to start cutting my videos in the short form as an advertisement for long form, and I quit doing it because the short form people didn't come. They did not watch the long form videos. The responses I got were antagonistic, and people could not understand my arguments, and thus just called me stupid. And I'm like, okay, well, we're going to go this, force decides. And if you ever see me, then run. If you really want to go this way, then like the way that this actually is, because I just have to physically dominate you. And while I'm 40 something and probably can't do it as easily anymore, I am trained with the Mauser. So you should consider what you're doing. And they're like, and I'm like, I think violence is stupid, so I don't want to go there. But if you really think that that's how you're going to integrate it, like violence becomes the only the only social option. And I do think this is really bad for the left, because I do think a lot of these memeified things get brought up. But unfortunately, what worries me is you see left academics kowtow towards it a little bit because they think they need to stay relevant. You know, that maybe they can sneak in some smarter stuff later. But I just gave up on it because I'm like, I don't want to argue with people just calling me dumb because they don't understand my argument because they can't listen to a more than 3-minute clip. And I can give you 2 depressing anecdotes that are not proof of anything, but they are ubiquitous enough that I have a problem. I'm a teacher in Utah. You think doing the kind of advocacy that I do, that would be a problem. The reason why it's not is my students do not have the attention span to watch my videos. And this includes honor students. I've had several tell me, I found your stuff, it was interesting, but I couldn't watch something for more than 10 minutes. So your videos are too long. Like, what are you doing making 15 or 30-minute videos? And I'm like, I make 3 and 4 hour videos, sweetie. Because some of the stuff can't be distilled. And like, well, if you know something, you can make it simple. I'm like, no, some stuff you really can't. Not like that. Not in a matter of time as well as a matter of explanation.
Yeah. And then there's the whole dialogue form. You know, a lot of podcasts, there's a dialectic, there's a dialogue, a back and forth that develops, that requires a certain amount of movement in the conversation that you can't simply produce or command in a short unit of time. And I, as much as I like making 1 hour or 2 hour long podcasts, I always think that my books are the best things I make. And only a small percentage of the people who watch my stuff on the internet actually buy and read my now very cheap Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies with Edinburgh University Press. But to me, that is the best thing that I've ever made. And it's because I can actually sit with each line. I can try to make sure that all of the stuff fits, that my usages of words fit together across a very large space of text. I have time to be able to work through tensions in my argument and figure out how I want to deal with very, very complicated issues, that there's just no way you can do that in an extemporaneous format, no matter how much reading and how much writing and talking you do outside of it. You can bring some of that to it, but you can never bring as much to any kind of video, even a long form video, as you can do with a book. And the crazy thing to me is that there's the people who read books, there's the people who watch long form videos, but this is a niche thing, long form video now. Long form video is around where the novel was in the 60s. It's something that you do if you're, a little bit, you fancy yourself a kind of educated, a little bit, artistic person, but it's no longer the primary way in which culture is disseminated and developed. Now we're, to the short form video and the edit, the thing that the really young kids love are those edits with the music. And this is just all about a vibe. It's like, mystery ritual cult stuff from late antiquity, that's just about creating a woo-woo kind of sensation in a lot of these videos. All of these like hard style remixes of songs, that are, this kind of booming, fascistic beat, and then the military imagery and all of this.
Oh yeah, I find this weirdly fascinating, but also found that like what you do see a lot of times on short form videos is like Sumer women who are obviously positioning themselves as sex objects also trying to sneak news in. Like, I'm just like, okay, like, wow. And I don't want to sound like that there's no counter tendencies in Zoomers. There are. I have known people to get fed up with this and go read books, really, truly. But it is no longer the general trend. And to support your point on long form video, not even in like what we're doing, not like in this long talk show format, but like in a narrative format. I used to teach only from 2019 to about a year ago, a lit and film class that when I first offered it, because it allowed you to read 2 books and watch a bunch of movies, was so in demand that we had to cap it because like it was like 200 people wanted into the course. I have trouble getting 40 kids into it now, and I quit. I actually passed it on to another teacher because it was so hard to build up because so many kids did not want to do it, and it was clear that many of the kids in the class were actually not watching the videos and relying on AI summaries. And also when I told them to review the video, they confused an AI summary with a review and didn't understand why I was like, no, a review is not you just telling me what the thing is about, which you obviously didn't even watch it anyway.
And people used to do this with spark notes and novels. And now it's all the way down to, movies, the thing that used to be the break and the easy thing, the layup, now this is impossible to get people to actually do. It's a huge problem. Yeah. And no, it's not the case that we can just rely on short form video content to reinvent art and culture in some other form such that everybody gets the same benefit. It does matter that people be able to conceptualize concepts, develop what they think an abstraction means and apply it. And you have to be able to write to do that and to be able to think in a precise and methodical way. And video, the image, doesn't generate that kind of thinking. It generates a vibe. It generates a kind of, it's more like a psychedelic experience relative to the text.
Absolutely. And I do find the idea that we can't do anything about this frustrating because I'm like, no, we can't fix it. We cannot fix it just with formal education. That is absolutely true. I agree with Freddie on that. But I'm like, the idea that we just can't do anything is foolish. But I do think, to come back again, it would take international coordination to just say, okay, this is junk food. You can have a little bit of it, but it cannot be the majority of consumption. Sorry.
It would take coordination. But, people just act like anytime one of these things happens, the whole post-World War II order is to be taken for granted. And if it's replaced, it will be with terrifying nationalism. And those are the only choices. So you have to cling on to this post-World War II system that can't protect us from any of these things, much less empower us to do anything to make a world that's actually worth living in.
I do think that if I have like my strategic failure of the left in its imagination is frankly, and I wrote a whole book on this now with Daniel Tutt, and I will also say writing is really helpful. Writing with someone else is really, really helpful because I can tell you when you're full of shit. And you have to like make some concessions. If not a co-writer, you need a really good editor. Because there's there in writing, there's a dialectic between the sociality of it and the individuality of it that comes out. Because it's an individual act you kind of have to do, even when you're collaborative writing. I still have to like write down things by myself, even when I'm working with someone else. But then I have to take all the social learning, all the dialogic stuff that comes before that. You know, for me, years of talking on podcasts, like decades actually of talking on podcasts, being distilled down in engagement with other thinkers. And what was a relatively short book because because it's easier to publish, and two, because I think people might read it. Maybe. But it's really important that we do this. And I think, you know, one of the things I've told people is like, well, if you ever been on like left TikTok or left Instagram, if you think left Twitter's bad or left Facebook was bad, the vapidness and easy manipulation of like left of the left video formats and short form really is under discussed. People might complain about BreadTube versus BreadTube or any of that, but I'm like, all that's actually not as relevant as it was 6 years ago, and this has happened really, really quickly. I mean, the fact, and I really did, and this I will sound like, you know, even though I'm not anti-AI, I'm not anti-video, obviously.
How could you?
But the domination of short form videos is perfectly correlative with the decline in literacy in the developed world. It is like 1-to-1 correlations, even down to the date you started seeing it. And before that, there was an argument to be made that actually, even though you weren't building up extensive reading skills or intensive reading skills, like close reading, you weren't getting that from the internet, but people were reading more on the internet and the aughts and early teens, even if they were reading less novels, which was problematic for points of intention and long form debate, but at least they were reading. And when you got to TikTok, Instagram, and Vines, that started dropping off precipitously worldwide.
Because it's not just short content. It's short content that's designed to get you to watch to keep watching more short content. So when you start with it, it's, well, I'll just watch a short content, a short thing, and then I'll get back to my serious stuff. But it's designed to hook you on that. So you think you're only committing a very small amount of time to it. And then before you know it, an incredibly vast amount of time is gone. And it used to be that in these kinds of windows, when people wanted something to do, they would have to embark on something that if they wouldn't finish it in that unit of time, they would make a significant contribution to it. They would start a book, they would read a chapter of a book, that you would do something more serious in those intervals. Or when you wanted a break, you'd get a magazine, you'd get something that gave you something more substantive to deal with. And now, because you have this easy option of just in any situation, without paying any kind of subscription fee, without purchasing any kind of specific volume, you just have these short form videos. People waste entire days of their life, huge amounts of time on this stuff that doesn't stick in your brain, doesn't teach you anything, doesn't make you a better person, and encourages intellectual sloth, because since it feeds you stimulus very, very readily without you having to engage with it on any level, it degrades over time a lot of the intellectual muscles which come from trying to find meaning and make connections out of something longer and bigger.
Yeah. I mean, people understand this when you talk about the effects of modernity on your physical body and on like muscle mass and whatnot. They don't, they really ignore it on brains. Yeah. And again, neither one of us, I want to be very clear, neither one of us are anti-technology. Neither one of us are Luddites. Like, I know this about you. I know that obviously my entire project will be hyper paradoxical if I was. Right. But I do think it's a real problem, because I think a point you made back like a half an hour ago, and this will be my last point. One of the things that makes me somewhat unique amongst Marxists, and it's not in my book, but it is in a lot of the thinking that went into my book, is this complexity system thinking notion about specialization, that you invoke more and more high level energy, intellectual energy to specialization, and you see a general degradation of skills until you have an elite that are so specialized they can't really think outside of very, very, very narrow constraints. And then you have a general public that also can't really do anything and is so specialized when there's an economic change, they can't really adjust. That there really is no other option for them because they spent, their lives specializing on this very specific humanly limited skill that, as you were talking about, it's actually kind of mind numbing. And you do need some of this complexity and division of labor and whatnot for a complex society. I don't know how you don't have it. But to the extent that we have it today, it leads to both an incompetent general public and an incompetent elite that is not incompetent on its specialization, but its specialization is so narrow that, what else can they do? And I think that does lead to them, like even the business sector and even the military, which is an area that I used to think had natural checks against this, being easily calmed by grifters because no one has enough to scout information and knowledge and general skills to put it all together to see how to deal with the grifting.
Right. So then you don't have a coherent unit that's capable of cratting. You don't have an Aristos, you don't have a Demos, you don't have a unit that can crat, and you're path dependent, and you're just stuck following institutional and structural imperatives that you lack the capacity to revise.
Right. Well, I mean, and Tainter says these systems just die. Like he doesn't say it's inevitable. He has like 9 examples in history where they don't. But he's like, but more often than not, they collapse due to their energy needs and over specialization.
Modernity is that modern systems are designed explicitly with less virtuous people in mind. These modern systems were created after Montesquieu's Persian letters, after Vico's New Science, with a view to how do we create a social system that is operable by people who are degraded with regard to their capacity for political activity, with regard to their ability to collectively cooperate and take decisions together, who, when they try to do this, tend to get into civil conflict with each other of the kind Hobbes describes in Behemoth. People who, we're going to design a world where they don't have to think about fundamental values, because if they think about that, they'll get into conflicts with each other. Where not only do they not have to think about it, but we ensure to some degree that they don't think about it because we regard this tendency as dangerous in people. And insofar as it reappears, likely to result in totalitarian or horrific, abusive, tyrannical acts. So the thing that's really bizarre about modernity is that it's designed to be compatible with degenerated people. And as we keep going further and further in modernity, we make people who are less and less able to independently organize stuff. And we just keep trying to find out, can modernity work with people who are even less able to do this kind of stuff than the previous generation of people, who are even less socialized and even less able to independently cooperate? How degenerated can people be and have modern systems still work? How advanced is this new science of modernity? Can it take on board and work with even extraordinarily limited, narrow subjects?
I mean, the problem that I think you have is something that Peter Turchin and co. turn out, which is you have both an overly competitive and degenerated elite too. And so this idea that modernity is like, okay, we're going to include everyone in politics. Oh shit, that doesn't work. So now let's create a politics where they can all seem included and all have a say, but not have any effect on anything. And I do think this is the great irony of like liberal democracy. You and I both say, we've said this both explicitly, if you think you're going to get rid of the administrative state, you're on crack. But particularly immediately, like that's not going to happen overnight. But at the same level, it is odd to me when I hear the great stalwarts of defending democracy from the progressive left defend the administrative state, and until very recently, because it's been taken over by reactionaries, the judiciary, the 2 least democratic areas of government. And I'm just like, you really don't have faith in civil institutions, which sometimes actually do what you want, but you don't even have faith to let that happen.
Yeah, there's a real tension between modernity and republicanism, and the attempt to unite those things has always been very fractious.
Yeah, it's I guess part of me is a small r Republican, and that like I don't feel like we have any other way to have mass politics, which is what you need for class equalization. Um and I do get the frustrations with okay, well, every cook may be able to govern, but they can't run a nuclear submarine. And I'm like, okay, I get your point. Um, but also, if you have a non-competitive elite class, they also eventually won't be able to run the nuclear submarine, but they have the keys to it.
The question is, can we create modern structures which create space for the development of human capacities, as opposed to just narrowing and emptying people into more and more specialized roles? Is there a way to bend modernity around a little bit to the point where it generates a flourishing of people's abilities as opposed to just a closing up?
And if the answer is no, I don't know that there's a human future. Which, by the way, some of our tech overlords have just decided that no, there isn't, and that's okay. And I'm like, whoa. I mean, Peter Thiel has almost all explicitly stated that maybe like the world will be better without people in it if it was only run by our profit maximizing robots. And it's like, oh, who's that world even for? But anyway,
these guys are disgusted by their own employees. They're disgusted by the people that they themselves have shaped and helped to create.
Oh yeah, it's hilarious that like, oh no, the socialization that we impose on you, we don't like it. But I mean, I do think this is something that I have critiqued Marxism for, was the assumption that more and more centralization would always lead to more and more socialization and skilling of labor, which has just seems to have reached its zenith in the 1960s. Like,
and at this point, skilling and socialization don't obviously go together at all.
Right. Like yeah, completely unrelated to each other almost.
Indeed, maybe even opposed.
So thank you, Ben, for your time. We've been talking for about 2.5 hours. Where can people find your work? Where are you writing these days?
Yeah, it's been delightful. You could find on my about page on benjaminstudebaker.com most of the stuff that I write externally. I've also got a Substack these days that where I write stuff more informally. And of course, I am very keen to, and I'll do it one more time, plug my paperback of Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, which is the best thing I've ever made, and it's currently the cheapest any book I've ever published has been or is likely to be for quite some time.
I would tell people read that book. I was super enamored with it. Because I do think if we don't do it actually speaks to the question of my book with Daniel Tutt, which is like, why does dumb populism keep on emerging left, right, and center? And why is that
pluralism stuff in my second book, I think really maps on well, and I think it's an interest, especially because you come at it with a very different literature from what I tend to draw upon in that second book. So we come onto some of the same themes from very different bodies of literature. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that because I was like, you and I come from almost a structural economic, like mostly Marxist analysis. Daniel comes at it from like from a Marxist psychoanalytic and sociological way, and you come at it from like a structural functionalist. I should not say structuralist because it has a very specific meaning. A structural functionalist analysis of the way states interact. We've all kind of come onto similar problems and why this populism keeps on emerging and why it can't do anything. Because essentially what it's promising, I think we all agree, is impossible under current constraints. But then when that fails, people don't try to imagine something new. They just flip back to like, well, another world is not possible. Woe is me.
I have to compete in elections, and I can't come up with a strategy that wins elections other than populism. Therefore, I'll just reinvent populism again. That seems to be where people are at.
Yeah, I literally thought that because I'm like, Anton and Anthony Borriello and Anton Yeager like a year ago were declaring left populism's dead, and I'm like, well, it was, and then Mondani won, and we are right back. in the cycle of people trying to do this again, and you're even seeing them dust off moving the cloud again, and like
I could go on for a whole hour just about moving the cloud.
Right. Like, well, I think it's terminally damaged a lot of Marxist brains.
If I don't like to blame theorists for things because, of course, the things that happen have structural causes. But if I was gonna blame theorists for things, the cloud and move.
Yeah, I also think one of the things leftists need to do, and particularly Marxists who say they care about structural things, is quit like blaming stuff on intellectual genealogies. However, I also agree with you. I would make a special exception for cloud move because it did feel like, you just came up with a left justification for utter capitulation and made it look like it wasn't that. Like, yeah. But anyway, thank you so much, Ben. I really enjoyed this conversation, and you will probably be back on the show eventually anyway. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
It's fun.